They hung around if they thought you didn't love them is another story that came out of my daily writing exercises. In this particular exercise, I used the word Jimmy as the anchor, went with the flow, but always came back to the anchor. They hung around if they thought you didn't love them, by Sheila Horne. Jimmy called me every day at 8 o'clock in the morning. He knew I stayed out late in the summer with my friends and a certain boy that he said wasn't good enough for me. Jimmy shouted into the phone that it was time I got my lazy butt out of bed, and he showed up with Rodney and Rosabelle. Her real name was Augustina. She hated it because it was her great-great-grandmother's name, and she was a large woman with jet black hair and a stern look. Rosabelle and Rodney were going steady back then, yet they never spoke to each other, unlike Jimmy and I. We gabbed about everything and anything, no matter where we were or who we were with. In school, we were put in different classes because our conversations disrupted everyone. The kids made bets to see when we'd finally run out of things to say to each other. It never happened. Not that we were in love. I knew he'd never truly love me. He reminded me constantly he needed me but couldn't love me. Rosabelle said it was because of my parents. At least, that's what Rodney told her. But it had nothing to do with my parents. It had to do with Jimmy. He couldn't stay still. He jumped from girl to girl. He was charming and slick and didn't have a problem meeting girls. You had to be on your toes with him. If you slipped up and fell in love, it was all over before it began. I could have loved him. I just didn't want to. I think Jimmy knew it. That's why he hung around. That's the way it was with those types of boys. They hung around if they thought that you didn't love them. What I knew about Jimmy that all the girls didn't know, and he didn't know about himself, his true love was his red convertible. My baby, he called it. That was fine with me. I was just happy that at least he loved something. Anyway, Jimmy, Rosabelle, and Rodney picked me up every day, and we drove to the beach. I sat on the sand and watched Jimmy sprint back and forth yelling at me to get off my arse. He said arse with a peculiar ringing kind of lilt. I knew Jimmy would never account for nothing more than a crazy handsome fella. I knew I was pretty enough, but I would never be his one and only. I knew my family wouldn't accept him. They thought him too low on the social ladder. Then the Beatles invaded and the DJs played their songs all day. We sat in Jimmy's car, our legs stretched out on the dashboard, and listened to the radio. We thought we'd go deaf before we turned 20. Who cared? It was all about rock and roll and cars and being on the beach. All the boys imitated the Beatles, dressed like them, wore their hair like them. Some of them even started playing guitar. Not Jimmy. He was into cars. He loved to race them on the back roads and play chicken in the dark and fix them. He drove so fast it made my head spin, and he loved to talk about wars. Rosabelle said she hoped we never had another war. Rodney said we wouldn't. We'd already fought 3. Jimmy wanted a war. He was enlisting as soon as we graduated from high school, so he'd be ready to fight. I told him I wanted to be an airline stewardess. Instead of joining the army, he could be a pilot, and together we'd rule the sky. He thought it was a good idea until Rodney pointed out that it might cause a problem with our spouses. Jimmy said he didn't think so because him and I were buddies, and spouses can't make you stop seeing your buddy. Rosabelle agreed with Rodney. She said men and women didn't like their spouses having a friend of the opposite sex. After high school, Jimmy was one of the first to be shipped to Vietnam. He left Baby with me with instructions on how to look after her. I could drive her, but I had to be extremely careful. Since we could no longer talk to each other, we wrote letters every day filled with minute-by-minute details of our lives. Then he came home on leave, and the first thing he did was come over to take Baby for a long drive. He examined her to make sure she was okay. Then he took a look at me and said I looked different, and he wanted to know when I had grown breasts and hips. We went down the beach, and he told me he wasn't going back to Vietnam. The place was a horror, and boys were getting killed or maimed for life. He planned to go AWOL and make his way up to Canada. I told him I'd go with him because I always wanted to see Canada. He said I couldn't. Rodney was right. If he met a girl and got married, she'd never let him have a buddy that looked like Natalie Wood. I knew what he meant, but I had nothing to say.